While you were reading about cowboys, somebody else was counting the money. That somebody was not a cowboy. He had never been a cowboy. He had never slept on the ground or crossed a flooded river in the dark or eaten salt pork for 60 days straight. He had never made $30 a month. He had never made $30 a month because $30 a month was what you paid the men who did the actual work, and he was the man doing the paying. His hands were clean. His office was in Chicago, or New York, or London, and he owned more of the American West than any 10,000 cowboys combined would ever see in their lifetimes. This is the story nobody told alongside the cowboy story. The story of who actually owned the land, the cattle, the water, the towns, and eventually the men themselves. Not through force, or not only through force, through paper, through contracts and deeds and legislation written by men who understood that the real frontier was not the open range. The real frontier was the law. And the law could be purchased. The mythology of the Wild West was built on the cowboy. The economy of the Wild West was built on the cattle baron. And the difference between those two things is the difference between who did the work and who collected the reward. Start with the land. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres to any American citizen who would settle and farm it for 5 years. It sounds generous. It was, in theory, exactly the kind of democratic redistribution of land that the frontier was supposed to represent. The small farmer, the independent settler, the man who came from nothing and built something on his own piece of ground. What actually happened was different. 160 acres sounds like a lot until you understand the geography of the American West. In the eastern states, 160 acres of good farmland with reliable rainfall could support a family indefinitely. In the semi-arid plains of Kansas or the dry grasslands of Wyoming, 160 acres was not a farm. It was a slow death. The rainfall wasn't there. The soil wasn't what the pamphlets promised. A family needed 10 times that acreage to run enough cattle to survive, and 10 times that to actually build anything beyond survival. The cattle barons understood this before the settlers did. They understood it because they had people whose job it was to understand it. Lawyers, land agents, men who read legislation carefully and saw the gaps between what the law said and what the law could be made to do. The technique was simple, and it was used so consistently across the West that it became almost a standard business practice. You hired men, your cowboys, your ranch hands, anyone on your payroll. You had each of them file a homestead claim on 160 acres of land adjacent to your existing holdings. The law required the claimant to live on the land and improve it. Your men filed the paperwork, visited the land enough times to satisfy the minimum requirements, and then signed the deed over to you. One cattle baron, dozens of employees, thousands of acres acquired at the cost of filing fees and a small bonus to each man who participated. The law designed to give land to small settlers was being used as a bulk acquisition tool by the men who already had more land than any individual could legitimately manage. This was not secret. It was not hidden. It happened in front of land office clerks who knew exactly what they were looking at and continued processing the paperwork because the men doing it had enough political connection to make looking the other way the professionally sensible choice. The water was even more important than the land. In the American West, water was not a convenience. Water was survival. A ranch without reliable water access was not a ranch. It was an expensive way to watch cattle die slowly. The man who controlled the water source controlled everything downstream from it in every sense of the word. The cattle barons who understood this early moved to secure water rights the same way they secured land. Aggressively, comprehensively, with legal tools that the small rancher couldn't afford to use and political connections that made challenging those tools essentially futile. A homesteader who settled on land without understanding that the water source 3 miles away had already been claimed by the largest ranch in the territory would discover the problem the first dry summer. His cattle needed water. The water belonged to someone else. The someone else had lawyers, and the homesteader had a failing crop and an eviction notice. Some homesteaders fought back. Most couldn't afford to. The legal system of the frontier was not designed for a man with no money fighting a man with a great deal of it. The circuit judge came through twice a year. The cattle baron's lawyer was there every day. The winter of 1886 changed everything and changed nothing. That winter killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of the cattle on the open range across the northern plains. The losses were catastrophic. Ranchers who had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in the fall were bankrupt by spring. Entire operations that had run for a decade were wiped out in a single season. For the small operators, this was the end. No capital reserves, no ability to restock, no way to survive a loss of that magnitude and start again. They sold what was left for whatever they could get and left. For the large operators, the ones backed by Eastern capital, by British investment firms, by the kind of money that could absorb a catastrophic loss and still be standing. The winter was a disaster that eventually became an opportunity. The land was there. The water rights were there. The infrastructure of fencing and buildings and access roads was there. It just needed to be purchased from the men who couldn't afford to hold it anymore, at distressed prices. Because when a man is desperate, the price he accepts for something reflects his desperation more than the value of the thing. The consolidation that followed the winter of '86 was the moment when the cattle industry of the American West transformed from something that had at least the appearance of open competition into something that looked much more like what it actually was. A small number of very large operations controlling most of the viable land, most of the water, and most of the economic activity across enormous territories. The cowboys who worked for these operations were not employees in any meaningful modern sense. They had no contracts. They had no protections. They could be hired in the spring and let go in the fall with no obligation and no recourse. The wage was set by the operator. If the operator decided that $30 a month was the wage, then $30 a month was the wage, because the alternative was no wage at all, and there were always more men coming west who needed work. The cattle barons did not think of this as exploitation. They thought of it as the market, supply and demand. Labor was abundant on the frontier, and abundant labor was cheap labor, and cheap labor was good business. The men who did the work were free to go elsewhere if they didn't like the terms. The fact that elsewhere offered the same terms or worse was not the cattle baron's problem. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we follow the money when the money tells the real story. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because every video goes where the history actually went. And drop a comment below. Who do you think really won the Wild West? I read every one. The company towns were the logical endpoint of this consolidation. When a cattle baron owned enough land in a remote enough location, the nearest actual town might be 50 or 60 miles away. Getting supplies meant a day's ride in good weather and an impossible journey in bad. The solution was to build a company store on the ranch property, stock it with the supplies the workers needed, set the prices. This is where the mathematics of the cattle baron's operation became something darker than simple wage suppression. A cowboy making $30 a month who bought his supplies from the company store at company prices was not actually making $30 a month. He was making whatever was left after the store took its share, and the store's share was set by the same man who set the wage. Some operations ran on a system of credit that made the cash wage almost theoretical. The cowboy needed supplies before payday. The store extended credit. The credit accumulated. By payday, the wage was already spent on the credit balance, and sometimes the credit balance exceeded the wage, leaving the worker technically in debt to his employer. In debt to his employer, who also controlled his housing, his food supply, his access to the nearest alternative, and his employment. A man in that position was not free in any practical sense, regardless of what the law said about his theoretical liberty. This was not unique to the cattle industry. It was the standard operating model of extractive industries across the American West in this period. Mining companies ran the same system. Timber companies ran the same system. The frontier that had been sold to the American public as the great democratic space where a man could make himself through his own labor was, in practice, a place where the terms of that labor were set by men who had arrived before the democratic mythology and secured the land and water and capital that made the mythology irrelevant. The political influence of the cattle barons was not subtle and was not meant to be. Wyoming's territorial legislature in the 1880s was not controlled by cowboys. It was controlled by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which was the organized political voice of the large cattle operators. The laws that came out of that legislature reflected the interests of those operators with a consistency that was not accidental. The Maverick Law of 1884 made it illegal for cowboys to own unbranded cattle found on the range. Before this law, a cowboy who found an unbranded calf, a maverick, could claim it, brand it, and start building his own small herd. It was one of the few legitimate paths by which a working cowboy could accumulate enough animals to eventually operate on his own account. After the law, that path was closed. Unbranded cattle belonged to the association. The cowboy who claimed one was a thief. The law had been rewritten to ensure that the men who worked the cattle could never become the men who owned them. The Johnson County War of 1892 was the moment when the conflict between the large operators and everyone else became literal. The large ranchers, organized through the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, hired a group of armed men, some of them professional gunfighters brought in from Texas, and invaded Johnson County with a list of names. Small ranchers and cowboys who had been accused of rustling. The accusation was not always false, but it was also not always true. And more importantly, the process being used to address it was not a court of law. It was an armed invasion by private citizens acting on the authority of their own wealth and their own grievance. The invaders killed 2 men before the surrounding community organized a response and pinned them down. The U.S. Army arrived and took the invaders into custody. None of them were ever convicted of anything. The political connections of the men behind the invasion made prosecution essentially impossible. The men on the list, the small ranchers and cowboys who had been targeted, understood what had happened. The large operators had attempted to use private violence to solve an economic problem. They had failed tactically. They had not been held accountable legally, and the economic conditions that had produced the conflict had not changed. The cattle barons won the American West not with guns, though guns were sometimes used. They won it with capital, with the ability to absorb losses that destroyed smaller competitors, with legal tools that the small operator couldn't afford, and political influence that shaped the rules of the game while the game was being played. The cowboy became the symbol of the American West because the cowboy was a figure that could be romanticized. The freedom, the open range, the man against the landscape. The cattle baron could not be romanticized in the same way. He was a businessman. He sat in offices. He read contracts. He instructed lawyers. He was too recognizable, too familiar, too much like the men who had built the Eastern industrial economy that the West was supposed to be an escape from. So the mythology kept the cowboy and found ways to either ignore the cattle baron entirely or to make him into a supporting character in someone else's story. The villain in a Western film, the obstacle the hero overcomes, not the man who actually organized and financed and profited from the entire enterprise. The open range closed. The cattle drives ended. The cowboys aged out of work that their bodies could no longer sustain. The towns that had grown up around the industry contracted or disappeared entirely. The cattle barons, or their heirs, or the corporations that had bought their operations, held the land. They held it through the transition from open range to fenced ranching. They held it through the agricultural changes of the early 20th century. Some of them hold it still, in the form of ranching operations that have been in the same family or corporate ownership for over 100 years. The cowboy got the myth. The cattle baron kept the land. That was always the deal. It just took a while for everyone to understand the terms.